Okay, so Lydia, are we operational?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. I'm your host, Vicar John Evans, and I'm joined, of course, by my excellent, admirable mentor and colleague, Lydia McGrew. Dr. Lydia McGrew, welcome.
Thank you for having me, John. It's always fun.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into an episode which I am deliciously calling, in light of your inspiration, Christmas in July, going over some of the challenges to the historicity of the birth narratives in Matthew and in Luke. And this is near and dear to my heart in light of a lot of the deconstructionist nonsense that has pervaded not just popular culture, but even regrettably, even some mainstream corners of scholarship. So it will be exciting to dive into a defense of the reliability of the account of Jesus's birth.
I know. I got notes here. I was really glad I did a debate years ago with a skeptic named Jonathan Pierce. I don't usually do debates, but that gave me an opportunity to collect a lot of my notes about the birth narratives all in one document. And when I was prepping for our talk today, I was able to go back to that and, refresh my memory and bring those together again. So if nothing else, that debate with Pierce did that for me. It helped me to put everything in one place.
Yeah. One of the really interesting elements, right, is, and I understand that this is probably an element in no small part due to our beautiful artistic traditions here in the Western world, where you have the image of the star over the manger and very clearly medieval looking three kings, and of course, shepherds present. I can understand why this might sound rather folkloric to many, but when I read the gospel accounts of Matthew and Luke, I see something very different from my historical eye. I see references to real historical figures, Caesar Augustus, Archelaus, Herod the Great, references, of course, not to three kings, as much as I love that tradition. And, hey, maybe all the mystics are right, but certainly in the text Magi from, of course, the East, who are recorded in Herodotus, I see very real elements on the ground. And I would say that mostly the challenges I see to the text come either through ignorance, I would say, or frankly, an anti-supernatural bias and unwilling to see Matthew and Luke as writing the genre of history. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
I definitely see those solid historical things on the ground. Archelaus in particular, because he's not exactly like some super famous person. I once heard a scholar say that he was completely incorrect, that it's a better confirmation of the Gospels if they refer to famous people than less famous people. That's completely opposite. It's a better confirmation if they refer to less famous people. And so Archelaus is a better confirmation than Caesar Augustus, because, for example, we know about this sort of stormy beginning of his rule there in Judea, and how he actually got upset because there was a riot in the temple, and he sent mounted soldiers in, and they killed a bunch of people in the temple. And it would have been shortly after that 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 the Holy Family was coming back from Egypt, or very plausibly could have been. And Matthew specifically says that when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in the place of his father Herod the Great, he didn't settle in Bethlehem. Instead, he went to Nazareth. Now, in Nazareth, Herod Antipas was reigning, who was another son of Herod the Great. So someone might say, well, why is that any better? Well, it's better because or could seem better because if Joseph heard of this wild event where all these people were slaughtered in the precincts of the temple, then he could say, I left to get away from one murderous madman. I don't want to settle under another one. And they also had family connections back in Nazareth, as Luke indicates. So that's actually like a coincidence between Matthew and Luke. So that's an excellent confirmation. The other thing I would say, though, is I think the birth narratives get questioned even by Christian scholars for two poor reasons. The first poor reason is that they come from a generation earlier. So the disciples, I mean, I understand this is a consideration, that the disciples themselves wouldn't have witnessed those events, right? Jesus is an adult before these disciples come to know him. But it's not really a problem because there still would have been people alive whom they could talk to, including Mary herself. And then the second, even worse reason is just a complete allergy to harmonization, so that you find an admission that shouldn't be made of some kind of giant number of contradictions between Matthew and Luke, when actually, by my count, there's only one apparent contradiction. We can get to that later, but the point is, because they've been taught that it's bad scholarly practice to harmonize, then they just are like, oh, throw up our hands. We don't know what's going on. And that unfortunately goes beyond an anti-supernatural bias to another set of bad scholarly practice and methodology within New Testament studies itself.
In fact, the allergy to harmonization would ultimately shred our ability to understand the ancient world as a whole. This is why, unless I'm wrong, traditionally classicists would love to harmonize primary sources.
Well, until you mentioned postmodernism, I think there's actually a what I might call light version of postmodernism. So not necessarily, Derrida, nothing has any meaning, but maybe Richard Rorty or something, like, postmodernism light, that I think has had an unfortunate influence in the classical world, particularly on a classicist named Christopher Pelling, who's been a big influence on Mike Licona, and his views on the genre of the Gospels being partially non-historical. Pelling, unfortunately, does not harmonize even Plutarch, even though, Plutarch is nobody's theologically committed to, Plutarch, or theologically opposed to Plutarch, but Pelling will go searching out the simplest, I would not even say apparent discrepancies, things that are just very easily harmonized in Plutarch, claim that they're discrepancies, and then claim that Plutarch is engaging in some kind of fact changing. And Licona has followed him down that road. So sometimes when I talk to people about harmonization, I say, look, I harmonize Plutarch. I'm not doing this because I'm committed in a theological way to the Gospels. I'm doing it because it's good historical practice. And unfortunately, some classicists don't even use that good historical practice either on other primary sources, because it's this kind of, ooh, it's so cool that they were changing the facts, that they were using these devices, and that seems cooler to them than harmonizing.
It just seems to me that if I want to understand the life of Socrates, I take Xenophon, I take Plato, and I take Aristophanes, I take my primary source documents, and I have to harmonize if I want to believe that there is a real historical event to which there are multiple eyewitnesses. And it seems to,
Absolutely.
yeah. It just seems that the rejection of that is to engage in a literary trope to the detriment of the historicity of what we are preserving. And but what I would say is your excellent work in texts like "I the Beholder," "The Mirror and the Mask," things like that, right? They raise to the front the reality that I don't think anyone in antiquity is thinking along these literary tropes. At least
Right.
I don't see that there.
Yeah, especially not in these super mundane uh ways, like one of the alleged contradictions in Plutarch was that he has one senator call Caesar Augustus, or sorry, Julius Caesar, a robber in one of his lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, and in another one of his lives mentions a different uh senator who called him a highway bandit or something. And it's like, oh yeah, that's like a super literary. No, this is a very boring, it's a very boring kind of thing, right? Why am I going to transfer it from one senator to another? And we find that in the Gospels as well. In fact, if we reject harmonization, we have trouble even with contemporary knowledge. So, for example, if you said Tim McGrew, my husband, is from Pennsylvania, and then something else you read said Tim McGrew was born in New York State. And, a modern critical scholarly attitude would make a contradiction out of that. But in fact, both of them are true. He was born in New York State, and then his parents moved when he was just a little baby doesn't even remember, to Pennsylvania. So they're both true. And similarly with Jesus, he was born in Bethlehem, and then they moved to Nazareth while he was still very young, and that's why he's known as Jesus of Nazareth. This is a mundane thing. It's not a contradiction.
Absolutely. I think the other big area of scholarly pushback, at least I remember from my own seminary days, was pushback against the supposed ahistorical nature of the census in Luke that gets mentioned again and again and again and again, for which I think, you and Tim both have done excellent work, just utterly, I think, debunking the fact that there is a lack of historicity here. What would you say about, also too, if you have time, the methodological error of needing to have multiple source attestation to make any historical claim verifiable, considering, if I look at the life of Alexander, life of Socrates, life of Julius Caesar, any major figure from antiquity, I have a lot of single source data. That's even true for Herod the Great as well. Would those two areas be also an area of critique that we get?
Yeah, yeah. So it's what I call the anti-standard that everything in ancient times needs to be recorded and needs to come down to us recorded twice at least. And there is no such rule that we have to have two sources for everything. It's ridiculous. So that's completely wrong. Um, and this is true of the census. And that's an example there that because Luke is our only source for a census in the region of Judea at the time of the birth of Jesus. So that's going to be, before 4 BC, because Herod the Great died in 4 BC. And by the way, Luke clearly knows that Jesus was born in the time of Herod the Great. He's explicit about it. But we don't happen to have another record of a census right in that area right at that time. And so this phony standard that everything has to be recorded and we have to have a record of everything twice is being applied, among other things, to discredit that. It's a terrible, terrible standard, especially when you consider that, as Tim has pointed out, all of the books that we have that have survived from the first century, about that first century AD, from about the time of Christ to about 100 AD, would fill like one shelf. I mean, a lot of stuff just didn't. And they include, super trivial things like a treatise on agriculture or something. It's not as though everything was preserved. Um, Stuff rotted away. Papyrus, you know, disintegrated. Things didn't get copied and so forth. So we have to be careful not to be anachronistically putting our information age over onto what has survived to us from that century.
Absolutely. One critique I was hearing repeatedly is that Luke supposedly says the whole world needed to be taxed, when in reality, I'm pretty sure the Greek text basically only would say that the whole land needed to be taxed. And of course, land and world are not necessarily synonymous. Have you heard of that critique?
Oh yeah. I mean, you could translate it multiple ways, but I mean, we sometimes say this, everybody in the world has heard of Elon Musk, right? Well, probably not literally everyone in the world. I imagine there are some people in isolated places who've never heard of Elon Musk. So yeah, it's throughout all the land or whatever. It's vague. It's a vague expression, and you need context to see. One of the worst translations, I believe the NIV says all the Roman world. So it's like they're trying to help, but they're not really helping. The word Roman isn't there. So it's a very strongly interpretive um, uh, so-called translation being put on that. And it's like, please don't help. Just translate it as it stands and let a pastor or someone else, make the point that this could mean almost anything, just a region. I suppose it could literally mean the whole world. It could mean the whole Roman world, but we've got to find out from historical context what it actually means.
100%. The other element, which I think gets a lot of interesting literary pushback, is the element, of course, of the star and of the magi themselves, naturally given, mythological accretion over time, legendary accretion as it occurs. But the texts themselves seem to present figures who fit very well within their historical time and place. I believe the text refers to magi. They are recorded in Herodotus. They are a very real political class that does exist during the period, and a religious class. The idea of looking to the stars as a form of preparation for the birth of individuals or a change of empires is common during the time. So that doesn't fall outside of the practice. So where really is the challenge for people accepting the historicity and reality of the Christmas star and the Magi? It seems like a pretty straightforward historical account rather than a mythological text. Matthew begins with the genealogy, and Luke specifically begins with descriptions of political figures. So if I look at Matthew, which is my sole source, unless I count the patristics, which you and I know I love to include the patristics, like Ignatius of Antioch on this point. But if I look at Matthew, Matthew is setting up this account to be very historical and to be about real persons and real events.
Right. I think a lot of times people get historically triggered by brevity. And here's what I mean. There's a lot more we could wish that Matthew had told us about those magi. What exactly does it mean that the star stopped over the house? Like, we don't know of any natural phenomenon that would literally move visibly through the sky and then appear to stop over the house, that you could be following it at night. A meteorite, it's going to plunge toward Earth and wink out. A actual star or even a planet is going to, rise and set, but it's not going to stop over a particular house. So we wish he'd said more. We wish he had said more about why did they say specifically where is the born king of the Jews? Like, why the Jews specifically, right? They could have traveled from the east to the west and not necessarily been looking specifically for a king of the Jews. So there's a lot that we could wish to know that we don't know. And I think people assume that because something is stated relatively briefly like that, that's similar to the resurrection of the holy ones at Jesus' crucifixion. It's super short. There's a lot more we want to know. How did people recognize them? How long did they stay? Did they ascend to heaven with Jesus? Etc. That it's assumed that it's mythical. But I think what's happening here is that the author is just telling us what he knows and no more. In fact, I think if he elaborated it more, that might be suspicious. So this is what he knows. This is what he says. And as far as that goes, it's got a certain amount of restraint.
And in fact, I find the restraint to be one of the highest elements of its accuracy and historicity to me. The fact that I am not told necessarily that their names are Balthazar, Caspior, Melchior, that they are, the very fact that it is so terse, for me, lends to the fact that this is common knowledge, that common knowledge is being reported. Same thing with the Massacre of the Innocents. I always thought that the attack on the Massacre of the Innocents historically made little sense, considering it fits the pathology of Herod really, really well. Herod is known to have done things kind of like this.
Absolutely.
It doesn't not fit his personality. Along with the flight into Egypt, one of the elements that has always boggled me is how that's theologized as a matter of allegory or symbolism, when in reality, we know that there's a thriving Jewish community in Alexandria, hence you have Philo. So what is it simply once again a hang up of genre there, or is it simply a hang up of methodology in that case?
Well, I think it's a hang up of methodology. There's a tendency for scholars to just repeat what other scholars have said. So it's become what the kids call a meme, that Matthew invents the flight to Egypt to make Jesus into the new Moses. Now, I would go so far as to say I'm not even sure that Matthew is seeing Jesus as the new Moses there, not even after the fact, because the verse he quotes, when Israel was a child, then I loved him, and out of Egypt have I called my son, refers to the nation as a whole, not to Moses. In fact, if Matthew's making up the story to make Jesus look like Moses, why doesn't he have the infant Jesus part the sea or something? He could have made up things that would be a lot more Moses-like there. So when people but people just keep saying that, and it never occurs to them to question it in the way I just questioned it. Really? He could have come up with a better verse to try to compare Jesus to Moses. He could have come up with a better phony story to compare Jesus to Moses. Why the flight into Egypt and then this odd application of Hosea? I think it sometimes takes an outsider to the discipline to think of those things, because within the discipline, they are all taking in each other's laundry and they just keep repeating these things. Jesus is the new Moses in Matthew. Matthew is doing this to make Jesus the new Moses. And nobody ever stands up and says, no, they're not. No, he's not, and questions it.
So, I mean, one question for you is once again, I look at the death of the firstborn narrative in Matthew. Everybody, of course, wants to connect this with Exodus 1. But in reality, I see some fundamental differences. First of which is the fact that male children 2 years old and younger are being targeted, not infants. The method of slaughter is fundamentally different. They're not exposed. They are presumably killed by the sword, presumably. And of course, what's very interesting is it's not a flight that occurs as a result of maturation in the royal court of Herod. Instead, it's a flight while Jesus is still a child. So once again, if you wanted to create greater parallels, I think you could. Plus, the Hebrew Bible does record, I think it's Athaliah in Chronicles or Kings, who tries to kill off all of the children of her opposition. So this is not an uncommon practice, regrettably, in royal courts.
Oh, absolutely. And they're her own descendants too. I mean, she's like killing her own grandchildren. It's just horrible. Which is the kind of thing that Herod the Great also did. He killed some of his own sons. He killed some of his wives, that kind of thing. The As you say, this is very plausible, and Jesus is not hidden as the infant Moses is hidden. Instead, his family gets up and runs away. They leave the country altogether, which is not the means by which Moses is saved. It's not even close to being like the means by which Moses is saved. I think also the death of the innocents sometimes gets argued against because this person or that person doesn't mention it. Why doesn't Josephus mention it? Sheer argument from silence, of the bad kind. There are good, bad, and ugly arguments from silence. This is a really bad one. Could have been only a couple dozen babies. Bethlehem was not, that big of a place at the time. And there were plenty of other grander brutalities, in a sense, that the Herodians carried out for Josephus to mention. So we need to really get a robust sense of how plausible it is that certain things just don't get mentioned elsewhere.
Absolutely. Now, turning to Luke for a moment, we come to the narrative that includes the shepherds. And of course, the shepherds become, idiomatic of music and of art and literature, of course, in the West. The way I've always argued historicity when it comes to the shepherds is if you want people to show up in a first century context at the birth of the Messiah, it's unlikely, given the social expectations and strata of shepherds in first century Israel, that you would have shepherds show up at the birth of the Christ. That is actually a rather odd choice to make in the first century AD. Would that be a good assessment?
I think that's a good point. There's a criterion of embarrassment kind of thing going on. I have not researched, but I would be cautious to emphasize, shepherds were complete outcasts. Sometimes people will exaggerate, like that shepherds were hated or disrespected or whatever, and I think that's going too far. But it is a somewhat odd choice. The other thing is, of course, we don't even have to argue for the historicity of each element of the story separately in order to argue for the historicity of the gospel in such a way that it's come to Luke in a plausible fashion, and then therefore he's recording it, and then that's a reason to believe that shepherds actually were there. An even stronger criterion of embarrassment, and I think one of the strongest arguments for the historicity of Luke's infancy accounts in particular, is the things that the angel says is recorded as saying to Mary at the Annunciation, and also the things that Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, is recorded to have said. These are very Jewish, and they're also very puzzling in view of Jesus' horrible death. So the angel doesn't say, he will be the suffering servant. He will, by his stripes, we are healed. You know, we know that Isaiah 53 was very much revered by the early Christians, that they used it in their preaching and so forth. Peter does this in one of the Petrine epistles. He alludes to Isaiah 53. But the angel instead says he will be great and will be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he will reign, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Full stop. Okay. Nothing about him dying, not even a tiny little foreshadowing hint, you know? Now, why? If Luke is making this up, or if anybody's making this up, after everybody knew that Jesus died, even if they believe Jesus rose again, why wouldn't you put some kind of foreshadowing of Jesus dying into those words of the angel? Or Zechariah, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all that hate us, to perform the mercy promised to our forefather and to remember his covenant forever. And thou, child, shalt be called the prophet of the highest, for thou shalt go before the face of the Lord to prepare his ways. I can hardly ever say in the liturgy the Song of Zacharias without sort of shaking my head and saying, wow, they weren't really safe from their enemies. You had the fall of Jerusalem. I mean, not within our time, right? Not yet. You've got to give it an apocalyptic meaning to even believe that it's going to come to pass. Why put that in, into your story? So I think that argues for Luke's truthfulness and the truthfulness of whoever, perhaps Mary, who was telling him, look, this is what was said. This is what the angel said to me, And then if the Christians are going to find meaning in that an apocalyptic meaning, he will eventually return to reign, they're going to have to do that separately. That isn't in the story itself. So I really like that as an argument for the scrupulousness of the people involved in telling us these stories in Luke.
It also historically only makes sense within a pre-70 AD context, because ultimately, if it's in a post-70 AD context, while you can accurately report post-70 AD, I believe, for example, John accurately reports his gospel in the 90s, right? Nevertheless, most authors are going to be embarrassed to say we will be saved from the hand of all those who hate us after Jerusalem has been utterly leveled. So even for dating, it does place it in my mind much, 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 much earlier.
Or if it were later, again, it's that scrupulousness that it's just like, yeah, I know it looks weird, but that's how the story went, And so you just put it in there. So I just think it shows a lot of truthfulness on the part of Luke.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned one apparent contradiction that you've looked into compared to the supposed dozens of apparent contradictions. What is supposedly the apparent contradiction that you see?
Okay. So, and I'm not counting the fact that there are two different genealogies. And so setting that aside, because the genealogy in Luke actually isn't in his infancy narratives, it's the lead into the baptism. So, all right. Aside from the fact that there are two different genealogies, it's the fact that Luke says, and when they had, I don't have this exact quote, but when they had done all things according to the law, something like that. They returned to Nazareth, or they went to, they went back to Nazareth. So that's after the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In Luke, there you have the scene in the temple with Simeon and Anna. I don't think Luke would have worded the return to Nazareth that way, even if he was going to leave out the flight to Egypt, if he knew about the flight to Egypt. That's just my sense of it. I think even if he was going to leave it out, he would have worded it a little bit differently. Something like, and later they returned to Nazareth, or something like that. Eventually they returned to Nazareth. So I think there is a plausible case that can be made, and I am not an inerrantist, in fact, that Luke did not have our Greek Matthew. In fact, I think it's one of the strongest arguments that Luke's infancy story is independent of Matthew's infancy story, and that he didn't have that. He had his own source for Jesus' infancy, and he just surmised that, understandably, because whoever his source was didn't happen to tell him about the flight to Egypt, that they went back right away. He knew they went back eventually. I have a theory about that. This is only a theory. This is conjectural. My conjecture is that the Virgin Mary may have thought, if she was talking to Luke, we're still in the 60s, let's say, or maybe even the 50s. It might even be the 50s, and she's talking to Luke. She may have thought, hey, the Herodian dynasty is still around. I'm just not going to tell about this. This guy's going to go out there. He's going to tell everybody whatever I tell him. And I'm just not going to talk about this horrible thing that Herod the Great did. And so she may have worded it, told about the story about Hannah or Anna and Simeon in the temple, and then said something like, and later, when we were once again living in Nazareth, we went every year to the temple, and when Jesus was 12 years old, blah, 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 blah. Okay, a more abrupt transition. And then Luke, he's a really good writer and so forth. He just kind of smooths that over with that phrase, something like, when they had done everything according to the law, they returned. Because that's what he's thinking. And you can regard that as an error on his part, but that's really the only one I see that is recalcitrant to harmonization. And if nothing else, I think it does argue for the factual independence of Luke and Matthew. My guess is that Matthew had some other source, probably more connected with Joseph, possibly, again, this is conjectural, James, I would say, brother of Jesus. The Catholics would say kinsman of Jesus. But anyway, who knew Joseph. I think Joseph was dead by the time of Jesus' ministry, but someone else who didn't have a problem. We were just like, I'm going to tell that terrible thing that horrible guy Herod the Great did, and just told that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I see no reason why these texts cannot be harmonized in any way, shape, or form. And what I would say is that there's good historical data to suggest that a Joseph background for Matthew and James. I mean, James is bearing not just oral memory, and this is where things can get really dicey with speculation. Why not even terse written memory at some point? The genealogy is very specific, very, 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 very specific. And I've always been marked by the fact that at some point, if Joseph is of the royal lineage and line of David, surely that would have been preserved in some familial sense, in some familial way, whether it is a very strong oral memory or even written. So
I think it was important to Jews. It's really funny. Richard Burridge, the liberal New Testament scholar and classicist, who has been so influential on calling the Gospels this semi-factual, semi-fictional genre of Greco-Roman biography, according to him. Anyway, he says that the adding of genealogies is a sign of attempting to conform to the genre of Greco-Roman biography.
yeah,
I just don't see it that way at all.
yeah.
Jews were extremely interested in genealogy. I mean, it was huge. You would know what tribe you were from. Like, even after all of the Old Testament exiles and so forth. They still tried to keep a sense of, okay, he's from the tribe of Levi. He's qualified to be a high priest and so on. And so I think that Jewish origin, as you say, be it oral and memorized or written, definitely accounts for the presence of genealogies in these stories.
No, in terms of the harmonization earlier of Nazareth and then flight into Egypt, is it a matter of controversy because in Matthew they flee directly from Bethlehem, whereas they're coming back to Nazareth in Luke?
Well, it's controversy because Luke uses a phrase that is, I think, fairly naturally taken to mean that they went back to Nazareth immediately. Now, if you want to insist on it, like if I were an inerrantist, I would just really camp out on the fact that Luke doesn't actually use the word immediately. And when
Ah,
they had finished all of this, they did not immediately return, or they uh, uh, immediately returned to Nazareth. He doesn't use that word. I think that's, a little strained. I think that's where the controversy comes in, is that just that wording. I think it's Luke 2:39, possibly. Uh, it sounds like Luke thinks that they did go back immediately, and then there would be no time for the trip to Egypt. But as I say, that's like literally the only discrepancy that I actually see in these accounts. And to hear people talk, there was this online debate. You can't find it online anymore. And I'm not saying that somebody's got some nefarious purpose and is hiding it. Things just do fall off. But there was an online debate, a written debate that Mike Licona did with Bart Ehrman. And Licona said over and over again about the infancy narratives, I don't know what's going on. I just don't know what's happening. I'm just not sure about, like, this is, this heavy sense of some kind of problem, right? And so I think it's refreshing to people to say, I got all of these things, and like they're all really easily solvable. There's one contradiction with between them, right? They're not, between Matthew and Luke. Whoop-de-doo.
and even that, in my mind, is not that tough of a contradiction. It seems less of a contradiction than I was recently reading, and I promise we won't get off the rails with this, but I was reading the account of Balaam and him being hired by Balak to curse Israel and Numbers, and the fact that he doesn't, right? And how in Deuteronomy it says, and he took Balaam's curse and turned it into a blessing. Well, one account looks like he's not cursing, and the other account says that he's cursing. That could be harmonized pretty easily in my mind as well, along with any other issue in these texts, with a matter of intent, with a matter of context, with a matter of grammar, right? But once again, even that seems more of a deep dive, roll up my sleeves than something like this. This seems far more minor.
Oh,
And
it is minor. It is minor. And as I say, I can easily imagine a scenario with verbal sources, real human sources, where this kind of thing happens. And that's where I say we really need to engage our historical imagination. I'll mention one other thing, which is not a contradiction between the two of them, but is one of many possibilities concerning the census. And there's a lot. We could like spend the whole rest of our time on just the census,
of
but
course,
right, so much. Um, a guy named Thorley, a scholar named Thorley, whom I've linked many times, has an article in which he suggests that yes, there was a census at this time. Luke is correctly recording this census. This census was being extended to the client kingdom of Israel and to non-citizens. Actually, we have another instance like that in the 30s from Tacitus. So that's not problematic, but possibly as far as Quirinius being governor, possibly Luke simply misremembered Quirinius from Quintilius. Okay, so P. Quintilius Varus, I believe, uh, was actually governor of Syria at the time of the birth of Jesus. He's the guy that lost the legions and had this, military disaster, pretty famous, famous in a bad way. Anyway, Varus, where are my legions? Cried Caesar Augustus. Whereas Quirinius was governor later. So this incredibly trivial and very imaginable possibility is one of several, and there are others that other people prefer, for the statement, this census was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Okay, so you just engage your historical imagination, and it's just like he just writes down. I mean, my gosh, I do this kind of thing all the time. Yesterday, I was typing something and I typed Paul Wenham. There isn't any Paul Wenham. It's John Wenham that I meant to refer to. Unfortunately, I read my blog post over before I hit publish and went back and fixed it, well, Luke doesn't have that. It's not that easy, right? When you're writing on a scroll and so forth. So if he just wrote Quirinius instead of Quintilius, so that's where we've got to have this sense of reality, which then allows us to see these very plausible possibilities.
Absolutely. And once again, the fact that if that was the worst case scenario, I could still sleep soundly and
absolutely.
And the very fact that we could postulate Quirinius being an earlier at a different time, a different stage. We could play games with the grammar. Does he mean, later Quirinius was governed? I've heard multiple theories, but the fact that could also be a possibility with Quintilius, it is shocking to me, genuinely shocking to me, that despite the robust historicity, I think, of these texts, we are still in a position where Christian institutions and Christian organizations and even self-reported Christian scholars are dismissing these as of a different genre.
Yes, or very problematic, or I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. It's like very angsty. Yeah, and it's one thing that I often point out that skeptics just never think about the census. It's a really important point. I call it breaking a nut with a sledgehammer. Um, so Luke's supposed motivation, right? For inventing this entire census that didn't occur at that time is that he needs to have Jesus born in Bethlehem, for goodness sake, because that's got to fulfill prophecy, blah, blah, blah. And yet Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth. What am I going to do? How am I going to get Jesus born in Bethlehem? And that Luke's like, I know, I'll invent a census and have his mother and father travel all the way to Bethlehem while she's pregnant and have the baby born there. My goodness, I can think of 5 better ways, easier ways to do that before breakfast. Why would you invent a whole census? Why not just say they were living in Bethlehem and later they moved to Nazareth? Like, why not just do that? Why or they traveled to Bethlehem to meet Joseph's family. I don't know, something. You're going to literally invent an action by the Roman government covering any significant region of land, however we interpret all the land, just to quote unquote get them from Nazareth to Bethlehem. That's crazy. That's like overkill. And I think that's a really important point that skeptics constantly overlook.
100%. Along with the fact that ultimately, when it comes to Bethlehem, they have to assume that an author is redacting, when in reality, why can't we just admit that if Matthew and Luke are writing in the 50s and 60s AD, you have many eyewitnesses or children of eyewitnesses who would have gladly said otherwise, and frankly would have benefited from saying otherwise, had Jesus not been born in Bethlehem. So just pushing Jesus out of Bethlehem seems to me, once again, from the bias against the genre of the text, and also to an anti-supernatural bias against prophecy. That leads us.
Yeah.
That leads us to the question of how pop culture, not so much, I think, genuine scholarship now, unless we want to go to the 19th century for this stuff, loves to bring up the virgin birth as somehow a pagan accretion. This, to my knowledge, is not taken seriously by most mainstream scholars now in any way, shape, or form. And the fact that there is a very short, in my mind, historically short gap of time from these events and when they are recorded, even according to the mainstream dating. What would you make of the internet nonsense about the virgin birth?
Well, something I was really struck with when I reviewed this in the last couple of days is that it's extremely hard to find virgin births, even in pagan literature. Like, I'm just going to rattle off a list of alleged people born of a virgin in pagan literature. All right, Hercules, Bacchus, Mithras, Prometheus, Perseus, Horus, Osiris. Um, none of those are actually born of a virgin. All right. I mean, literally, Mithras is born out of a rock, for goodness sake. A rock is not a virgin. Okay. Um, Bacchus, his mother Semele, was having a long-term affair with the god Jupiter, just a plain old sexual affair. And then she gives birth. All right. She wasn't a virgin. Hercules' father was Zeus, who seduced his mother in the form of her husband. He took on the form of her husband, and he fooled her. Horus, Isis bears him after recovering her husband's dismembered body and finding a way to get his seed into herself. She's certainly not a virgin. Despite the fact that his male organ cannot be found, in some versions she fashions a male organ for herself. The closest thing you can even find to a virgin birth in pagan mythology even is that the god Zeus lusts after Danae. Her father locks her up, and Zeus comes to her in a shower of gold, and Perseus is the result. That's still pretty sexy. I mean, if we put this bluntly, right? Look up Rembrandt's picture of Zeus coming to Danae in a shower of gold, and it's like, okay, enough already, right? It's this very physical kind of thing. That's the closest thing you can even find to a virgin birth. So even on their own terms, they're grossly inflating this the appeal that a virgin birth would even have in a in a pagan context. In fact, the thing I like to say, one of the most important things about the infancy narratives, they do not have an apologetic home. And here's what I mean by that. They don't have a plausible apologetic home in a pagan context. First of all, for the reason I've just given, that there really aren't virgin births, all over the place in a pagan context. But secondly, because both of them, both Matthew and Luke, are so Jewish. Look at the whole context. We were just talking about the Song of Zechariah, or the words of the angel at the Annunciation. And then over in Matthew, that he's the descendant of David, this long, rather tedious genealogy, which, by the way, I think it's probably Joseph's genealogy, and I suspect that that in Luke it's Mary's genealogy. That's just my guess. But anyway, and that he fulfills prophecy and all of this. Like, what pagan is going to care about that stuff? It's very clear that these are arising out of a Jewish context. They have heavily Jewish DNA. And so they're really not going to appeal in a pagan context. They don't look like they were constructed to appeal to pagans, but they definitely don't have an apologetic home in a Jewish context. The Jews did not revere virginity per se. They revered fruitful marriage. Every miraculous birth in the Old Testament is the result of sexual intercourse between a husband and wife. It's just that it's miraculous because the woman has been barren previously. Okay? Samuel is an example. Obviously, Isaac. Here's Sarah. She's always been barren, and now she's well past menopause. And Abraham is also elderly, but Isaac is the result of a natural coming together. It's just that God miraculously intervenes to allow Sarah to actually conceive from that. Samson being the third example. There aren't even Vestal virgins in Judaism. Like there's no at that time there's no wow, it's so wonderful for somebody to be a virgin, so we want to keep Mary a virgin when she gives birth to Jesus. Jews wouldn't have had any interest in that at all. So it doesn't have an apologetic home there either. This wonderful mixture of elements, I think, is a pretty strong argument for care and scrupulousness and historicity, and that they're not just making up the virgin birth.
100%. And the very fact that Mary would have vividly recalled all these events that clearly happened to her, and the fact that we know that she lives on, presumably, if I trust the patristics, and I do, that she lives on in Ephesus, and then John's hanging out, and basically John leaves behind students like Ignatius who reference events like the star. For me, I see the oral memory and perhaps even a written memory of the family of Joseph and Mary living on well into the early 2nd century, and it getting maybe muddled as time goes on in the 2nd century AD. But certainly, I don't see why something as momentous as God becoming a human being through the medium of a virgin birth, I don't see that flash in the pan disappearing in any sense, in any way, shape, or form.
Well, and we also have, even in the canonical books, evidence of Mary living in at least into the time of the early church, because Acts mentions she was present at Pentecost. So
Yes.
she's there with Jesus' brothers, Adelphoi, however you interpret that, his family, his kinsmen. So, and then of course her being committed to the beloved disciple at the cross, that's in the Gospel of John. So I really think she was around for a while, even if we don't know how long. She easily could have been someone that Luke spoke to, possibly during the time that Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea. That it wouldn't really have even been, and I think this is true generally, that Luke wanted to stay near Paul. He was Paul's companion, but I forget how long Paul was in prison, a year and a half or something. And it would have been easy for Luke to have traveled to, you know, Jerusalem, for example, and talked with apostles. And I don't think that Mary had moved to Ephesus yet at that time. He could have talked with her then. So that's no problem. That's easily imaginable. And in fact, Richard Bauckham, who's not even as conservative as I am, is pretty confident that Mary was an oral source for Luke. I want to also mention that for Mary to lie makes very little sense, for her to lie and say that she conceived Jesus as a virgin. I have a video. I think it's received more hits than any other video on my YouTube channel, because I called it "Mary, Did You Lie?" And I have a feeling that it's coming up in people's suggested videos when they're watching the music "Mary, Did You Know?" or something, because that's what I'm kind of riffing on there. But you think of Mary. Okay, first of all, would a virgin birth idea even occur to her as a young Jewish girl? I suspect it wouldn't even occur to her. But secondly, is anybody going to believe her? I mean, who's gonna believe her? If Matthew portrays a time after she's spoken to Joseph, we don't know if Mary and Joseph have spoken. Matthew doesn't say. But suppose they did. Joseph apparently doesn't believe her. He's going to divorce her, until he has a dream, and he's told, no, she really is a virgin. So the surrounding people are just going to laugh at her. They're going to either think that she and Joseph had sex prior to which I think is what most people thought who knew the family, because he married her, right? So prior to their official wedding, but during their betrothal period, or they're going to think that she had sex with somebody else and she's trying to cover it up. So why would she even come up with this particular lie? I can come up with better lies. She could say she was raped out in the countryside where nobody could hear her scream. That would be something she could say, you know, that that maybe someone would even believe, would find more believable, that some Roman soldier came along. And so she escapes the Old Testament condemnation, because that has to do with if you're in the town and you don't scream, then it's presumed that you were consenting. And she could be like, no, no, we were far out and I screamed and yelled and nobody came. She could have said that, you know, or she could have just gone along with the idea that it was Joseph. If Joseph was willing to go along with it, why wouldn't she go along with it? So I really don't see any advantage to her in making up this story. So once we get back to the idea that these documents come from people in a position to know, and that's our view of the authors, that they're trying to talk to people in a position to know, people who are close to the events, then we have to ask that question, Mary, did you lie? And then if we answer, nah, that doesn't make sense either, well, then it looks more historical and like it might just really have happened.
Absolutely. So on concluding notes, is there any point that you wanted to raise that I did not bring up so far? I mean, I could talk about this for 12 more hours because I love this. This is my bread and butter, as you know, in defense of the Gospels. But is there any other element of the birth narratives that is particularly spicy that you believe that we have missed?
Particularly spicy. Well, I just thought of one more thing I wanted to say about Mary not making up the story. Um, I found this in my notes yesterday, and I was like, wow, that's a really good point. Presumably, if Jesus is not anybody important, if he's not even a prophet, much less God incarnate, Mary conceived him naturally, she would know that nobody should expect anything important from this child. So it's going to really be a big letdown if she goes into this whole spiel, right? An angel came to me and prophesied that he was going to reign over the house of Jacob, and I conceived as a virgin. And then he's just this kid, and he just grows up and he becomes a carpenter, like his father. And there even was a long period, if he didn't begin his ministry till he was at least 30 years old, when I think he looked pretty ordinary. I mean, uh, wonderful, wonderful, non-sinning person, if anybody took the trouble to notice that. But I don't think myself that he did any miracles prior to that time. I know there are apocryphal gospels where he does, but think how embarrassing that would have been to her if she had made up the whole story. Hey, Mary, tell us again about how Yeshua is going to become the king in the throne of David, et cetera, et cetera. And she could have anticipated that when she became pregnant, right? That she's going to be an ordinary person. Let's not make up a story that raises expectations at this point. Make up a story that's going to fit with what she would then anticipate would happen, which would be just an ordinary life that he would lead. So I think that's a really interesting point that I wanted to come up with. Concerning the genealogy, I just wanted to say one more time that I do think that probably the genealogy in Luke goes through Mary. And I think the fact that Luke doesn't stop to explain that is again evidence that he doesn't have Greek Matthew. I think he may have Aramaic Matthew, but I don't think Aramaic Matthew contained the infancy story or the genealogy. And so I think if it was preserved and it was handed to him, and Joseph is the son-in-law of Mary's father instead of the son, and it's just said, of, I think it's Eli, then Luke conscientiously writes this down, and he doesn't pause to explain because maybe it was never explained to him that this is a son-in-law relationship, but is actually the biological genealogy of Jesus, which is important because the Bible always talks about the seed of David, and the Apostle Paul, who was according to the flesh of the seed of David. So if Jesus is indeed born of a virgin, Mary has to be descended from David herself, not just Joseph, who was not literally by his seed Jesus' father. So I think it's great that we have these two genealogies, and that would be my harmonization of them.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And of course, what would you make? What was the Yeshua ben Terah element that comes far later? I think that's Talmudic, right?
It's Talmudic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it may be, again, this is conjectural, but it's the kind of thing that I think a rabbinic mind would think of, because they love plays on words. That Panthera is like a, what do you call it, an acronym where you rearrange the letters, and you get Parthenos, that if they had heard a rumor that the Christians were saying he was born of a virgin, Parthenos, they would get a lot of pleasure out of a play on words to say, no, born of a Roman who was known as the Panther. Okay, because that's a kind of mockery. Oh, one more thing I did want to say about that Parthenos virgin. Of course, it's a skeptical trope that Matthew is misrepresenting the Old Testament when he quotes that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And what they often don't tell you is that he is actually correctly quoting the Septuagint, which
Yes.
predated the time of Jesus. Okay, so I'm sorry, take it up with the translators of the Septuagint into Greek, but they chose to use the word virgin, very, very explicitly. So this is not some kind of Christian abuse of the Old Testament. This really was there in the Old Testament, despite the fact that I think probably they didn't know what to make of it. I don't think the Jews really, I don't think they expected the Messiah to be, born of a virgin conceiving. And yes, the Hebrew word just means young woman. I believe it's Alma,
Alma.
yeah, Alma. But this is not something that Matthew is inventing. So that's important for people to know.
I've always found that the Septuagint's renderings are fundamental to understanding the Judaism before the arrival of our blessed Lord. And just in terms of scholarship, like you point out, Matthew knows very well what the Septuagint is saying. The audience at the time knows very very well what the Septuagint is saying. So I've always found attacks on Isaiah 7 to be very very weak, very very weak indeed, to the point where it has, as a Christian studying to be a minister and serving now as a minister, has always upset me that even Christian translations of the Bible, like the NRSV, will refuse to go with the Septuagint's rendering when that's relevant to the New Testament, and insist on putting, "Behold, a great sign! A young woman's going to have a baby." Great.
Well,
Great.
I might forgive them for that as long as they have a footnote. Footnotes are a wonderful thing. They could have, because then usually study versions of these Bibles will have a notes out in the margin of some kind. So I can sort of give them a pass. I'm trying, because they are going from the Masoretic, right? They're like,
Yes.
we're going to try to be. So if you've got a kind of principle that you've set up as translation, we're going to go within the realm of doing things smoothly, as literally as possible from the Hebrew. Okay, fine, translate it as, but in English, an almost better word would be maiden. And what people are not aware of, I don't know how many people would get the nuance of that, but because I've studied, I've studied Middle English, for example.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Very
Okay.
good. I see where you're going.
Mädchen, or
Yep.
German, Mädchen. Okay. Or even some dialects in England that survived up into the 20th century. I was reading an autobiography of a woman from that time, and she said, I forget what county in England she was talking about, Devon. I think it was in Devon. And she would walk up to the uh, walk up to the counter to be served at the post office, and they would say, "What can I get for you, maid?" And she said, "I wonder if still now in my old age, a unmarried woman of 40 is still called maid in Devon." Okay, that so that word maid has this, it has that dual connotation. It can be used to mean just a young woman or a young girl prior to marriage or of such an age that we might expect that she is not married. And you might add little maid if you're talking about, really little girl, right? But the word maid by itself, so it can mean young woman, but it can also literally mean a virgin. And so if you were going to go really literal, you wanted to use a slightly archaic usage in English, maybe a maid or a maiden shall conceive and bear a child would have that connotation that I think Alma probably did have.
Well, as the lover of Tolkien that I am, I'm definitely a big fan of that being a good via media, a true via media indeed. Yeah.
Cool, cool.
All right. So yeah, I think that should conclude things for now because I want to keep riffing, but I also know that I could devour the rest of the afternoon with this. So truly, Lydia, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I am immensely grateful to get this out there because once again, you and I read this material for scholarship and for edification, and because for me at least, it's very fun and delightful as well. But I think a lot of good folk don't have necessarily accessibility and would not get the distinctions between Alma and Bethula or Parthenos. So thank you. That's awesome.
Well, I'm trying to do what my YouTube channel says, making common sense rigorous. That's the motto. That's my motto as a scholar. And that can be applied here to the virgin birth and the Christmas counts. And it's fun to do this in the middle of the year at a time when I don't have everybody asking me to do it. It's something a little bit different for people.
Yeah. Any new content you want to advertise thus far that would be relevant?
Well, I'm spending a lot of time on my YouTube channel, as people know, and as you know, I suffer from chronic pain, and so um, it's hard for me to come up with like an entire new book project. But I put out new content every week on my YouTube channel, the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel, and my friend Eric Manning transfers that over to the podcast. I want to alert people to something. There are two different podcast links in Spotify and in Apple. You can find both of them if you go to lydiamcgrew.com. For content after November 2024, there is a separate link. So if you find a link by Googling and it only goes up to last fall, there is yet another link to be found, and you can find it by going through lydiamcgrew.com. That occurred because of a technological glitch that we ran into where somehow we got locked out of adding new content to the old link. So Eric started a second podcast link. So that's and I've been doing some really sort of bad tone stuff lately. I had a whole series refuting a theory that's actually it's a Jesus seminar theory, but it's also found, unfortunately, in Craig Keener, that John semi-falsified the role of the Pharisees in at the time period. Yeah, that
What?
that that John, the author John, is exaggerating the power of the Pharisees, and that the Pharisees wouldn't really have done the things that he attributes to them. So I have a 7-part series I just concluded, refuting that, and refuting this notion that the role of the Pharisees gradually develops as the Gospels get later chronologically. And then I'm going to pretty soon start a new series that's really going to make people mad. But when did that ever stop me? About Dr. Gary Habermas's new book on the resurrection and some really bad errors he makes in interpreting scholars, where he'll say even the Jesus seminar grants fill in the blank something that sounds really surprising, and you go and you read the book that he cites and he's misunderstood them. They don't really say that. And it's happening like again and again. And I don't think he's being dishonest. I think he just has really problems with being overly optimistic in his interpretations that are blinding him to a severe extent. So he's completely misinterpreting scholar after scholar. It's really shocking, and really undermines, unfortunately, his work and his scholarly legacy. So that's going to be a new series that I'm working on. And then one other thing that I'm hoping to do. So you'll be the first channel to even mention this out in public. Don't get too excited, people. It may not happen, but I'm hoping to do an audio book with me reading testimonies to the truth. Now,
Oh, yes. Please, 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 please.
this may not happen because I don't have all kind of fancy equipment, and I'm not going to go into an official studio, and I'm not going to buy a soundproof booth and, all of that. I only have, my own equipment, and the standards are pretty high out there, the industry standards. But I have a friend who's willing to edit for me to help to bring it up to the industry standards. I'm getting a pop mic filter, and I'm just going to go real slow. So it may be a long time, because I can't sit for a really long time recording. And also because if airplane goes overhead, I have to stop. I have to start the sentence over again to make it really high quality. So we don't know if this is going to happen, but this is something I'm hoping to get started on, and it can be a new project without my having to be really creative and come up with a whole new book.
Well, I'm excited, and if it comes to fruition, I will be the very first as the blind guy over here, visually impaired, to enjoy such an excellent, admirable work. And if it takes a lot of time or doesn't come to fruition, I understand, given how recording can go and quality can go and studios can go. So, excellent.
Excellent.
Really, really, really cool.
Thank you for having me today, John. It's been a lot of fun.
Same here, Lydia. This really helped me in my day, and thank you for helping once again, coming to the defense of the good word. It is always a relief to me.
God bless.
God bless.